For most of his royal life, Prince Edward had remained far from the loudest controversies surrounding the British monarchy. He was rarely the royal making headlines and had generally built his reputation through quiet service, public duty, and a willingness to stay away from family disputes. But according to the account behind this story, that quiet approach was eventually put to the test. What began as a disagreement involving a royal title and a historic home allegedly developed into a much larger confrontation involving property rights, family promises, royal jewelry, and the wishes of Queen Elizabeth II. At the center of it all were two things: Bagshot Park and Sophie's wedding tiara. And behind both were documents. The story begins with the Duke of Edinburgh title. For decades, the title had been closely associated with Prince Philip, who carried it throughout much of his public life. After Philip's death, questions naturally arose about who would eventually receive the title and whether the connection between the title and Philip's family legacy would continue. In 2023, King Charles III gave the title to his younger brother, Prince Edward. For Edward, this was much more than another royal distinction. It connected him directly to his father's legacy and gave him a title that carried considerable historical significance. But there was another part of Edward's position that would later become controversial. Bagshot Park. The large historic estate had been Edward's home for many years. From the outside, it looked like exactly the kind of impressive royal residence people associate with the monarchy. But according to the account, the property had required substantial work when Edward became associated with it. The building had reportedly suffered from years of neglect, and alternative uses for the estate had previously been considered. Edward accepted a long-term lease and took on significant responsibilities connected to the property. He also reportedly invested a substantial amount of his own money in restoration and maintenance. That detail would eventually become extremely important. Edward could argue that he had not simply been handed a valuable mansion with no obligations. He had accepted the financial responsibilities connected to the estate, invested in it, and maintained it for years. The arrangement also reportedly gave him a very long lease. As time passed, the value of Bagshot Park increased considerably. And that created an obvious question. What would happen if the palace later decided that the estate should be returned, reorganized, or used differently? For Edward, this was not simply a question about a house. It was a question about whether an arrangement created under one monarch could simply be changed by the next. That distinction mattered. A king has enormous constitutional importance, but becoming king does not automatically make every previous agreement meaningless. Leases can continue. Contracts can continue. Property rights can continue. And written agreements can survive the person who originally approved them. According to the story, Edward understood this very well. Instead of responding emotionally, he allegedly relied on the documentation surrounding his position. The original lease mattered. His financial records mattered. Evidence of his investment mattered. And most importantly, there was reportedly documentation concerning Queen Elizabeth II's intentions about the Dukedom of Edinburgh and Bagshot Park. If that documentation was valid, it created a serious obstacle to any attempt to simply remove Edward from the property. The palace could review costs. It could examine royal finances. It could reconsider how properties were used. It could continue the move toward a smaller monarchy. But changing an existing legal arrangement was a completely different matter. The monarchy had already been moving toward a smaller and more streamlined structure. Royal properties, staffing, expenses, and the roles of individual family members were all receiving greater scrutiny. Bagshot Park, because of its size and value, would naturally attract attention in such an environment. But Edward had something that made his situation different. He had years of records. He had financial commitments. He had a long-term lease. And according to the story, he had documentation showing what his late mother wanted. That combination made the situation difficult. The dispute was therefore not presented as Edward simply refusing to cooperate with his brother. It was presented as Edward insisting that the terms under which he had accepted the property should be respected. That was a much stronger position. Then another issue entered the story. This time it involved Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Sophie had become increasingly visible within the royal family over the years. She had taken on more public responsibilities and had developed a strong relationship with Queen Elizabeth II. One particular object represented that relationship: her wedding tiara. The tiara had been associated with Sophie's wedding in 1999 and had become one of the pieces most closely connected with her public royal identity. But according to the account, questions later arose about whether the tiara was Sophie's private property or whether it should instead be treated as part of the wider royal collection. That distinction was extremely important. If it was a private gift, Sophie had ownership. If it was crown property, the palace could potentially control how and where it was used. A review of the jewelry was reportedly described as an audit. On paper, an audit could sound routine. But for Sophie and Edward, the implications were allegedly much more serious. The question was not simply where the tiara should be kept. The question was who actually owned it. And once ownership was questioned, a much larger concern emerged. If the palace could challenge Sophie's tiara, what would happen to other personal gifts given by Queen Elizabeth II during her reign? Would other pieces of jewelry be reviewed? Could other gifts be reclassified? Could private possessions become institutional property simply because they had a royal history? Those questions made the disagreement much more sensitive than an ordinary jewelry dispute. According to the story, Edward's legal team examined the records and found an important piece of evidence: a deed of gift connected with the tiara. The document allegedly established that the tiara had been given to Sophie as a personal wedding present. If that was correct, the argument for reclaiming it became considerably weaker. The Queen's intention had been recorded. The gift had been made personally, and Sophie had possessed and worn the tiara for years. There was another important detail. Edward had reportedly been involved in creating jewelry intended to complement the tiara. The necklace and earrings were designed as part of a matching set. Over the years, the tiara had become part of Sophie's public identity. It had appeared at major royal occasions. It had been associated with her wedding, and it represented a personal connection with Queen Elizabeth II. For Sophie, its value was therefore not simply financial. It represented memory. It represented family. And it represented a gift from a woman who had become an important figure in her life. That is why the alleged audit created so much tension. Edward could see that the matter was no longer limited to property. His home was being questioned. His wife's personal gift was being questioned. And both disputes appeared to involve decisions made by Queen Elizabeth II. At that point, the story brought another member of the family into the situation: Princess Anne. Anne had spent decades working for the monarchy and had developed a reputation for discipline, practicality, and independence. She was not normally associated with palace drama. According to the account, however, Anne became increasingly concerned about what was happening. Her concern was allegedly not only about her brother or sister-in-law. It was about the principle behind the disputes. If Queen Elizabeth II had signed a legal agreement, what did that agreement actually mean after her death? If one sovereign could establish an arrangement and the next could simply ignore it, what would that mean for future royal agreements? That was a potentially dangerous precedent. A monarchy depends heavily on continuity. The current monarch inherits the crown, but also inherits decisions and obligations created by previous generations. A new sovereign can modernize. A new sovereign can reorganize. But there are limits. According to the story, Anne believed those limits were being tested. She allegedly confronted Charles with the argument that the authority of a monarch depends partly on the trust placed in that monarch's word. If agreements signed by one sovereign could simply be ignored later, future members of the royal family might no longer feel secure relying on royal commitments. The issue was therefore no longer just about Edward. It was about the credibility of the crown itself. That made the situation increasingly difficult for Charles. He was dealing with his younger brother. He was dealing with decisions made by his mother. And he was facing the argument of a sister who had spent decades supporting the monarchy. There was also an emotional element. Sophie had reportedly developed a close relationship with Queen Elizabeth II. The tiara, therefore, represented much more than an expensive piece of jewelry. It represented a personal connection. It represented family history. And it represented the wishes of a monarch who was no longer alive to defend them. That made the dispute difficult to treat as a routine palace matter. If the story was accurate, Edward eventually had something even more powerful than the existing documents. Private letters from Queen Elizabeth II were reportedly said to exist that could further clarify her wishes concerning Sophie's jewelry. The possibility of those letters becoming public would have created enormous pressure. There is a major difference between asking what someone intended and producing evidence of what they actually wrote. If the palace continued questioning Sophie's ownership, the letters could potentially reveal exactly what Elizabeth had intended. That is why the alleged threat to release them was so powerful. It was not necessarily an emotional threat. It was an evidentiary one. According to the account, Edward's position was straightforward. If the palace continued challenging Sophie's ownership, the documentation supporting the Queen's original decision could be made public. That would force people to examine the evidence rather than speculation. It could also reopen questions about family relationships and decisions made during Elizabeth's reign. For the palace, that created another problem. The monarchy depends heavily on controlling its public image. A private disagreement becoming a public legal dispute could damage everyone involved. Charles would face difficult questions. Camilla could face renewed criticism. Edward and Sophie would be placed under even greater scrutiny. And Queen Elizabeth II's memory would become part of the argument. That was precisely the kind of situation the palace would want to avoid. Meanwhile, the issue surrounding Bagshot Park remained unresolved. Edward's legal position reportedly rested on his long-term lease and the financial responsibilities he had accepted. He could demonstrate that he had invested heavily in the property. He could demonstrate that the Crown had accepted the terms. And he could point to the long period during which the arrangement had been allowed to continue. The longer such an arrangement exists, the more complicated it can become to simply reverse it. The story also compared Edward's position with other royal property arrangements, suggesting that royal property policies had not always been applied in exactly the same way to every family member. That gave Edward another potential argument. If he had fulfilled his obligations, why should he suddenly be treated differently? The question was not whether the Crown should ever review royal property. Of course it could. The question was whether an existing legal arrangement could be overridden without respecting the terms under which it was created. That distinction became the foundation of Edward's defense. According to the story, Charles eventually asked his legal advisors to review the complete file. This was allegedly the moment when the situation changed. The lawyers examined the lease. They examined the financial records. They examined the documents surrounding the title. They examined the evidence relating to the tiara. They examined the alleged deed of gift. And they allegedly reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Edward's position was extremely difficult to defeat. The problem was not that Charles lacked authority. The problem was that authority had limits. If Edward possessed a valid long-term lease, the king could not simply cancel it because he wanted the property back. If Sophie possessed a genuine deed of gift, the palace could not simply redefine the item as crown property without a legal basis. And if Queen Elizabeth II had deliberately documented her intentions, those intentions could not simply be ignored. The dispute had therefore reached a point where continuing it could potentially create more damage than ending it. But there was another factor. The family itself was reportedly becoming divided over the issue. People who had worked closely with Edward and Sophie for years were allegedly uncomfortable with the pressure being placed on them. The more people who became involved, the more difficult it became to keep the disagreement private. And once palace disagreements begin appearing outside the institution, the public starts asking questions. Who is supporting Edward? Why is the king challenging his brother? Why is a personal gift being reviewed? Why is a historic royal residence suddenly under scrutiny? And perhaps most importantly, why are decisions made by Queen Elizabeth II being reconsidered? Those questions could become more damaging than the original dispute. According to the story, Charles eventually attempted a more personal approach. Instead of continuing entirely through lawyers, he allegedly sent a private message requesting a family meeting with Edward. That represented a significant change. The dispute had started as an institutional matter. Now it was being brought back into the family. But Edward reportedly refused to meet without his legal advisors present. That decision carried enormous significance. It showed that he no longer viewed the situation as an ordinary family disagreement. He considered it a legal issue. And he wanted protection. There would be no informal conversation in which promises could later be disputed. There would be no misunderstanding about what had been said. The lawyers would be present. The documents would remain central. At that point, Edward had drawn a clear line. He was willing to continue his royal duties. He was willing to remain part of the monarchy. But he would not surrender his legal position simply to avoid an uncomfortable family conversation. The quiet Prince Edward had stopped trying merely to avoid conflict. He was now prepared to withstand it. That forced the palace to make a decision. Continue the challenge and risk a public confrontation. Or step back. According to the account, the palace eventually chose the second option. The issue surrounding Sophie's tiara was dropped. Her possession of the piece was allowed to continue. At the same time, the review surrounding Bagshot Park was reportedly brought to an end. The residents remained connected with the Edinburgh household. Edward retained the arrangements under which he had been living there. And the palace effectively stopped trying to force a new outcome. If accurate, this was a significant result. But it was not a victory in the dramatic sense. There was no public declaration of defeat. There was no press conference. The absence of further action becomes the answer. For Edward, that was enough. The documents had done what he needed them to do. The arrangements remained intact. Sophie's tiara remained in her possession, and Bagshot Park remained her family's home. But the personal relationship between Edward and Charles could still have been affected. Even if both men continued appearing together in public, the experience would be difficult to forget. Edward would remember that he had needed legal protection to defend arrangements connected with their mother. Charles would remember that his younger brother had refused to surrender without a legal fight. That kind of experience can change relationships. The public may see two brothers standing together at a ceremony, but private trust is much harder to measure. The monarchy requires public unity. That does not mean every member of the family must agree privately. Disagreement is inevitable. The real challenge is keeping disagreement from becoming institutional damage. According to the story, the dispute created a new balance inside the family. Charles and Camilla remained at the center of the monarchy and continued pursuing a smaller, more controlled structure. But Edward and Sophie had demonstrated that they were not entirely dependent on palace approval. Princess Anne had demonstrated that she was willing to challenge decisions she considered unfair. And younger members of the family were watching. William and Catherine represented the future of the institution. James and Louise represented another generation whose roles would eventually have to be decided. The dispute, therefore, carried consequences beyond the people directly involved. It raised questions about what kind of monarchy would exist in the future. Would it become smaller, more centralized, more financially controlled? Or would older family arrangements continue to protect individual members? Those questions would not disappear simply because one dispute had ended. For James, Earl of Wessex, the story could become particularly meaningful. He would eventually inherit the legacy of his father and grandfather. The Duke of Edinburgh title already carried decades of history. But after Edward's experience, the next generation would understand that royal titles come with complicated institutional relationships. A title can provide status, but the practical meaning of that title depends on property, responsibilities, public duties, and agreements. The experience could make future royals more cautious. They might insist on clearer documentation. They might demand stronger legal protections. They might be less willing to rely solely on verbal assurances. That is one of the long-term effects of a dispute like this. Once trust is damaged, people begin protecting themselves differently. And that may be the greatest legacy of Edward's alleged confrontation. Not that he defeated his brother. Not that he kept a mansion. Not that Sophie kept a tiara. But that he demonstrated the importance of preparation. He had apparently spent years maintaining records. He had accepted financial obligations. He had preserved documentation. He had relied on written agreements rather than assumptions. When the challenge came, he was ready. That is why the story presents him as unexpectedly powerful. He was not the most senior royal. He did not control the crown. He did not command the palace. But he controlled something else. His evidence. And evidence can change the balance of power very quickly. The story also reveals an important truth about royal life. The public often sees privilege. They see palaces, ceremonies, jewelry, titles, and historic properties. But behind those things are complicated legal arrangements. Not everything belongs to the king personally. Not every royal residence is private property. Not every piece of jewelry is crown property. Not every title automatically comes with identical rights. And not every decision can be changed simply because a new monarch has taken the throne. That complexity is exactly what makes royal disputes so fascinating. A headline might say that one prince is fighting over a house. The reality may involve decades of contracts and financial commitments. A headline might say that a duchess is protecting a tiara. The reality may involve a deed of gift and questions of private ownership. A headline might say that a princess confronted the king. The reality may involve a much larger question about the credibility of the monarchy itself. That is why the story cannot be reduced to a family argument. It is a story about institutions. It is about succession. It is about property. And above all, it is about trust. Queen Elizabeth II spent most of her life representing stability. Her reign was built around continuity. People knew what to expect from her. Her decisions carried the weight of decades of experience. According to the story, she understood that her children would eventually live under a different monarch. She therefore tried to create security for them while she still had the authority to do so. If the reported documents are genuine, those decisions continued to matter after her death. That is the irony of the entire situation. Elizabeth was no longer alive to enforce her wishes. Yet her signature, allegedly, became the strongest defense available to Edward and Sophie. Her authority continued through the documents she left behind. And that may be why the palace eventually had to reconsider. The king could change the future, but he could not necessarily erase the past. That is the difficult balance of monarchy. Every sovereign wants to leave a personal legacy, but every sovereign also inherits the legacy of the monarch before them. Charles inherited Elizabeth's crown. He also inherited her commitments. Some of those commitments could limit his choices. Others could protect members of his own family. And Edward's case became an example of that tension. By the end of the alleged dispute, the most important things remained where they had been. Edward retained his position. Bagshot Park remained his home. Sophie retained her tiara. And the documents created during Elizabeth's reign continued to carry weight. But the emotional consequences remained. The relationship between the brothers could become more formal. The palace could become more cautious. And future royal agreements might be documented more carefully than ever. For the audience, perhaps the most surprising part is how little of this would need to happen publicly. The monarchy can experience enormous internal disagreements while presenting a completely united image. That is part of the institution's survival. The public sees duty. The private world contains negotiation. Both realities can exist at the same time. That is why royal stories often have two layers. The first is what everyone sees. The second is what the documents reveal. And in this case, according to the account, the documents were the story. The house was only the symbol. The tiara was only the symbol. The deeper issue was whether a previous monarch's words still had meaning. And if the answer was yes, then Edward had found exactly the protection he needed. The final image of the story is therefore very different from the dramatic confrontation people might imagine. There is no need for shouting. No need for accusations. No need for a public rebellion. There is simply a legal file. Inside it are years of records. A lease. Financial commitments. A gift. A signature. And the documented intentions of a queen who is no longer alive. That file allegedly changed the entire balance of the dispute. Because Edward did not have to prove that he was more powerful than the king. And sometimes the narrowest argument is the strongest. The monarchy is built on centuries of tradition, but it operates in a modern legal environment. That means even the most powerful people must sometimes work within rules they did not create. Charles may be king, but the existence of that title does not automatically erase property law. Camilla may be queen, but that does not automatically make every royal jewel part of her control. Edward may be a prince, but his rights can still depend on contracts. Sophie may be a duchess, but ownership of a gift still depends on how that gift was legally created. These distinctions are rarely visible in royal photographs, but they become extremely important when a dispute begins. That is why Edward's alleged preparation was so effective. He understood that the monarchy could be intimidating. But intimidation is not the same thing as legal authority. A palace request is not necessarily a legal order. A royal preference is not necessarily a contract. And a new reign does not necessarily erase the previous reign's agreements. Those principles gave Edward a foundation. Once that foundation was recognized, the rest of the dispute became much easier to resolve. The palace had to decide whether continuing the fight was worth the cost. According to the story, it decided that it was not. That decision may have prevented a much larger crisis. A public legal battle between two royal brothers would have attracted enormous attention. The late Queen's decisions would have been examined. Private family correspondence could have emerged. The ownership of royal jewelry could have become a national debate. And the management of royal property could have come under intense scrutiny. By stepping back, the palace avoided all of that. But avoiding a public crisis does not mean the underlying disagreement disappears. It simply becomes part of the family's private history. And private history can last for generations. One day, the people involved may no longer be alive. Charles will eventually become part of history. Edward will eventually become part of history. Sophie and Anne will eventually become part of history. The documents, however, can remain. A lease can survive. A deed of gift can survive. A letter can survive. A financial record can survive. Future historians may one day examine those records and ask the same questions. Why was the property challenged? Why was the tiara reviewed? What did Queen Elizabeth II intend? Why did the palace eventually step back? And what did the dispute reveal about the limits of royal authority? Those questions could become more important with time. History often remembers the moments when institutions are forced to define their boundaries. This may have been one of those moments. For Edward, the lesson was clear. He did not need to become the loudest member of the family. He did not need to demand more power. He did not need to publicly attack his brother. He simply needed to protect what had already been agreed.